everybody, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I am bringing you my mid-year reading statistics. Welcome back, nerds. This is the video for you. We have passed the halfway point in the year, so the mid-year content has already begun. Please do not forget to check out my best books of the year so far if you haven't already. And this one, it is one for the nerds. It is going to be my reading stats for the first 6 months of the year. So every year I make 2 of these videos, one at the midway point, one wrapping up the year. This isn't so much an informative video for you guys as much as it is like a presentation of my statistics for the year so far. So I do have a reading spreadsheet where I track a whole range of things about my reading. I put like all of the page counts in there, the years that they're published, the authors, the publisher, all of that kind of stuff. And it's just interesting to me to see how my reading changes over time. So as well as presenting you my stats for the year so far, I am also going to be comparing it a little bit to the year before, and we'll see what the differences are, like what I'm reading more of, what I'm reading less of, and all of that kind of stuff. Now I do want to preface this by saying that this has by far been one of my worst reading years in quite a while. At this point in the year I haven't even read 50 books yet, which I mean every year up until this point I tend to kind of read more and more, and I really did know that I was going to be hitting a brick wall at some point and that there would get to a point where like I was not going to be able to beat my own progress. So I've kind of accepted it and I'm not really mad about it, but I am on currently at this point in the year 46 books, and I do set my Goodreads goal to 1 book more than I read the year previously. So in 2021 I read 117 books I think, and I set my Goodreads goal to 118 books this year. Now with my mental health not being great for the last couple of months, I have been feeling a little bit slumpy, dropped the ball on reading a little bit. I'm not mad about it, but that does mean that I have only read 46 books so far this year, and I'm currently 18 books behind schedule. Now all of these statistics are going to be as of the end of June, but like I've read 3 books at the beginning of July, but if I had included those then it wouldn't be mid-year stats because July is like the second half of the year, if that makes sense. So at this point last year I'd read 63 books, so I've currently read 17 books less than I did last year. Last year I was actually, and every year actually, I was ahead of my Goodreads goal, so this is the first time that I've ever actually fallen behind. While I do track, of course, as we all do, the amount of books that I read, I also track the amount of pages that I read, and this is definitely more valuable to me because I do tend to read very thick books. Like off the top of my head I can think of at least 7 books over 700 pages that I've read so far this year, and I'm pretty sure that there's probably more that I'm forgetting about. So at this point in the year I've read 19,594 pages, which considering I've actually read 17 books less than I had at this point last year, I've actually only read 2,020 pages less. So I actually decided to work out another statistic because I found it very interesting that I haven't actually read that many pages less than I did in 2021. So I've worked out the average book length for this year, which is 425 pages per book in comparison to last year, which was 343. So I'm over here thinking that I'm slumping, thinking that I'm having the worst reading year of my life, and yes, I've not been doing great. We know that. But realistically, the books that I'm reading are a lot bigger than they were last year, which is definitely contributing to why it seems like I'm not actually reading a lot. Okay, now that we're getting the graphs in, I feel like we need to readjust a little bit to give us some room because I never save myself enough space. But the first graph that we've got coming in tracks how many series, standalones, and rereads I read. It does have arcs on this table, but I actually put my arcs somewhere else. So this year I have reread 1 book, which I don't think I had any rereads at this point last year. It was House of Earth and Blood, ready for House of Sky and Breath. In terms of like the split of series and standalones, I always read more series than I do standalones because I'm a predominantly fantasy reader and fantasy tends to be series. There is a 3% increase in the amount of series I've read in comparison to last year, but realistically that comes down to like 1 book, and there is actually a 5% decrease in standalones, but only because we do have that 1 reread in there. Regardless, like I said, I'm always going to be leaning more towards series, so this is isn't something that I'm like concerned about or really have any thoughts on. For the books read per month, as you can see, the last 2 months have dipped dramatically in comparison to what I normally read. January is very clearly my best month and May is very clearly my worst month, and this is reflective of the amount of pages read as well, because I know last year my best and worst months in terms of books didn't match up to my best and worst months in terms of pages, but this year it does. And January I definitely read the most books and pages, and May I read the least books and pages. I didn't even make 2,000 pages in May, which is less than half what I normally read. For the star ratings, at the end of last year I did point out that I just didn't seem to be enjoying what I was reading as much, and I couldn't really figure out why that was, and that has continued a little bit into this year. Although I remember in January I think I had quite a lot of 5-star reads. That has definitely slowed down as we've gone throughout the year, and I think I didn't have any 5-star reads last month, and I haven't had any so far this month. So currently I've given out 8 2-star ratings this year, which is double what I was on at this time in 2021. The 3 stars are about the same. I had 14 this year, 15 last year, but last year I read a whole ton more books, so percentage wise I've read a higher percentage of 3-star reads this year than last year. For the 4 stars, only 15 this year, so only slightly higher than the 3s, whereas last year I had a lot of 4-star reads. It was coming in at 29. And for the 5-star reads, I've actually read 4 less than I did last year. I only have 9 5-star reads, and like I said, it has been like a couple of months. I think my last 5-star read must have been the beginning of May, and it was the first book in the Fits and the Full trilogy, and I'm currently about to start the second book, so fingers crossed we'll get a 5-star soon. For the demographics, we have a very large percentage of adult. I remember when this was about 50-50 adult and YA. We are currently at 76% adult books read, which is an increase of 15% on last year. And for our YA, we are currently at 19% of the books that I've read are YA, which is a 4% decrease on last year. But the interesting thing, is something that you're also going to see when we get to the formats part of this spreadsheet, is that if I had not read the entire selection series right at the beginning of the year in January and binged the entire thing, my statistics would be very different, because if you take that entire series away, I've only read 4 young adult books this entire year. I am just not reaching for young adult at all. I will say though that we do have a decrease on the amount of new adult that I've been reading this year. We're currently only at 4% for 2022, whereas in 2021 we were at 16%, so that's a 12% decrease. Here we go with the formats. So I have a 7% increase on the amount of like standardly formatted novels I've been reading. We always want this to be the biggest chunk, because this is essentially representative of all of the books that I own, and that is always what I'm going to want to be reading, because if I don't read them, why do I own them? You know what I mean? For audio, we have a 15% increase on the amount of audiobooks I've been listening to. We are at 22% this year now. I have been listening to slightly more audio than normal, but like I said, if we took out the entire selection series, the statistics would be very different. So that series just essentially skewed my stats in quite a big way right at the beginning of the year. So the amount of audio that we would have read without the selection series would actually be half, and it would then be representative of like 10% as opposed to 20. I have been listening to a lot of audio and reading along at the same time recently. I did it for the Rage of Dragon series by Evan Winters. I did it for a lot of the Greenbone saga, and these are books that I do own, but I have gone for the audiobook alongside just because I know or I've heard that they have really good audiobooks. The ebooks, not too much of a change on last year. We're at 9% as opposed to 12 last year. Comics is actually half. We're at 4% graphic as opposed to 8%. Haven't read a manga yet this year, which is interesting, but by far the most interesting statistic in this one is the dramatic increase we've had in the audiobooks, because as you guys know, I'm not typically an audiobook reader. For the genres, as you can see, we have quite a lot on here, but it is very obvious that the genres that I read the most of are fantasy, romance, and fantasy romance, actually in that order. So last year my second most read genre was fantasy romance, and since then I've been picking up a whole ton of contemporary romance. I'm a big fan of contemporary romance now. But in terms of like the increases and decreases on last year, fantasy is pretty much the same. We have just a 4% increase. Romance is the biggest difference. We have a 16% increase on last year, like I said, making it my second most read genre as opposed to fantasy romance, which we have just a 4% decrease. But in comparison to last year, like I haven't read any contemporary, I haven't really read any sci-fi. I've found that especially with my mental health being bad and me feeling slumpy, I am very much leaning into romance because I find them very compelling storytelling, very fast paced and very easy reads that don't require a whole lot of brain power on my behalf, because I have had issues focusing with like anxiety problems. So that could also be contributing to why I'm leaning quite heavily into romance at the moment. For these sources, so essentially the places where I got the books that I read from, thankfully my own TBR is the biggest section at 63%, and this is a 10% increase on last year, which is what we really want. For the hauled section, which is books that I've read that I've also hauled in this year, we're at 24%, which is pretty much exactly the same as last year. I always have a little bit of an internal dilemma between like where I want to balance it between those two, because I definitely want to be reading the books I already have, but then I also don't see the point in buying books if I'm not going to be reading them. So I guess I want it to lean more towards own TBR, and what I actually want to be doing is reducing the amount of books that I buy, which will then also reduce the amount of books that I'm hauling and reading, because if I didn't haul them, then I obviously can't read them. 9% of the books that I've read this year are also from Kindle Unlimited, where we have a 2% increase on last year, and only 4% of the books that I've read have been sent to me by publishers, which is a 6% decrease on last year. And we also have no books from NetGalley and none from Scribd. So I haven't been reading or requesting ARCs. I don't think I've requested a single book on NetGalley this entire year, which I'm absolutely fine with. And I think I might have said at the end of year statistics video that I have too many books that I don't need to read books that aren't out yet, especially because if I'm interested in them, I'll probably end up with a copy or buy a copy anyway. So there's no need for me to read them early. And I've been thinking recently, when I've been seeing, like very recently actually, when I've been seeing people read arcs that are especially like part of a series, they're then desperate for the sequel and they have to wait even longer because it's normally a year between releases, and they read it early anyway, which is a position that I don't particularly want to be in. So I'm quite happy with how that is going, and I'm also glad that we have that 10% increase on the own TBR section. While we're talking about TBRs, how many books have I put on my TBR this year, and how many have I read? Now we are doing things a little bit differently this year because I'm not making Bookopoly TBRs monthly, I'm doing bi-monthly, but it's still not working out very well for me. So I've put on my TBR so far this year 37 books. Now this is essentially just my Inner Circle Patreon pick books and also my Bookopoly books. They're the only ones that I actually put in the TBR section of my spreadsheet. So this is 15 less books than at this point in 2021, which makes sense because I essentially have 5 rolls per Bookopoly TBR, and with me doing them bi-monthly, there's 3 Bookopoly TBRs that I haven't made. So of that 37, I've read 24, which is 17 less than I read last year. However, we can't really compare these stats because, as I said, I'm doing things a little bit differently. So I did work it out as a percentage, and in 2021, I was reading 78% of all of the books that I put on TBRs, and in 2022, I'm reading 64% of all of the books that I'm putting on TBRs. Now, this is a little bit skewed because the last Bookopoly TBR I did was for June and July, and we're not yet finished with July. So like a lot of those books I still have time to read to complete the TBR. But I am finding that I'm, once again, mental health, not being able to focus. I'm not reading as much. I'm not reading as quickly. I'm not reading the same kind of things that I usually do. I'm very much dependent on my moods and, like I said, wanting to lean to romance, which for the first time in my life makes me less of a TBR reader and more of a mood reader. And my main thing, I guess, is that I really find that I'm struggling to keep up the pace and actually complete a TBR. It's just taking me longer to read right now, which once again is fine, but it is meaning that I'm not completing all of the TBRs that I'm setting, and I'm actually, in comparison to like my previous track record, I'm actually doing quite badly. I also like to track my relationship with authors. This is pretty much, are they an author I've read from before? Are they new to me? Or are they a debut? I don't read debuts very often. As you can see, I haven't read a single debut this year as far as I'm aware, but sometimes I forget to put it in debut. If it's an author that's new to me, I forget to check whether they're a debut author. But assuming that I haven't read any debuts, we are down 3% on last year, which obviously very small margin. I don't really read debuts. We have a 9% increase on the books from authors that I previously read, and we're currently at 65% for 2022, and we are at a 7% decrease of authors that I've never read from before, so we're currently at 34% on that. Now, I'm always torn about where I want this to be because I want to be broadening my horizons and reading from new authors, but at the same time, as somebody who reads a lot of series, if I'm continuing a series, then I'm reading more from authors I've already read from before, which builds that like known category. And I also, like, when I get invested in an author, I want to explore their like entire back catalogue. So I think I definitely do want it to be authors that I've read from before, but I think it's good to have a healthy balance between these two, because obviously I don't want to be reading the same things from the same people over and over and over again, because aside from not like discovering anything new that way, it also just makes things a little bit stale because I'm just kind of reading more of the same in a certain way over and over and over again. And then our final graph, which I'm going to shuffle right over here for because I know it's a big one, is the publishing wheel. That, as you can see, she's very chaotic, she's very messy. I'm not going through the entire thing. The only real reason that I track this is in case publishers reach out to me, or I want to reach out to publishers to be put on the blogging list or anything for ARCs, and I want to know like which publishers I actually read quite a bit from. It tends to be self-publishing, which we can see is dominating on here, and I do really love reading indie books, particularly indie romance and fantasy romance. We do have a 2% decrease on last year, but that's pretty negligible as this is still dominating on the wheel, accounting for just under a quarter of all of the books that I read, which once again, really happy with. Now, the pieces of pie are all over the place. They always are for this one, but typically my next biggest slices after self-publishing are Voyager and Galanx, because they're two fantasy imprints in the UK. They normally have about 10% each, and they are still represented and slightly bigger this year. But I've been reading a whole ton of Orbit books, accounting for almost 20% of the books that I'm reading, and I was trying to figure out why. I mean, I know I have just read the Greenbow Saga, which are all Orbit, but I think because I've been doing the Goldsboro vlog series, like, is the Goldsboro Science Fiction and Fantasy Fellowship worth my money? A lot of their books tend to be Orbit, and I think that that is also bumping this one up a little bit, making it so that I'm reading a lot more Orbit books than I usually would. So there you have it. Those are my statistics for 2022 so far, with a little bit of comparison and analysis from 2021. Please let me know down in the comments whether you enjoy this type of video. I know it's not particularly informative to you guys in that you don't really get anything out of it aside from just seeing what my reading's been like over the last 6 months, but I also know that a ton of you guys just really like the stats. So thank you so much for watching this video. Please don't forget to like if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.